the Abbasid Caliphate,
Mm.
spanning 500 years,
Yeah.
several continents, and the entire length of every Islamogram chud's mind,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, um, the more I read about it, as we got into it, I mean, you intrigued me about it.
So yeah, like I mean, I've been a Abbasid Caliphate fanboy for a while, but I was familiar with them in broad strokes. Uh, I have been quite interested in a lot of their thinkers, particularly. I mean, Ibn Khaldun was slightly after the Abbasid Caliphate, but they know Ibn Khaldun without the Abbasid Caliphate.
Yeah.
So I've been pretty interested in all the stuff they've done. They're referred to as the golden age of Islam. They're referred to as like the most progressive, but not in like the modern way we think of progressive, but like the genuinely most forward-leaning, inquisitive, intellectual, one of the most intellectual civilizations ever. And in the era of like the Christian Dark Ages, the medieval ages in Europe and the rest of the world that tended to be a relative backwater, these guys kind of shone as a beacon of hope, a beacon of intellectual development, a beacon of, hey, this is what a grand society can be. You know, during that entire late first millennia, early second millennia time span.
I was watching this lecture
Yeah.
about them, and this professor is talking about how he has a class of 70-something-year-olds in
Yeah.
the US. And when he told them
Yeah.
that the House of Wisdom's translation movement is how the Greek texts got to Arabic, and how those texts were ultimately how it got to the Western world.
Yeah.
They couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
It's like their jaws dropped.
Yeah.
And then their attitude was kind of like, and this is not what he said, but a lot of people have this attitude as, oh, the House of Wisdom was a transmitter. All it did was take the Greek texts from the Greek masters and pass them on to the Western world, who then really did great things with them. Couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
The analytical angle of the House of Wisdom, the forward thinking, and the House of Wisdom in particular, but even before,
Yeah.
even in the time of Al-Mansur, in the time of Harun al-Rashid, you see this openness first to the knowledge of India and an interest in Indian social sciences and Vedic
Egyptian
scriptures,
numerology,
math,
Indian numerology, all these
in,
things.
in the Egyptian canon. And then you see, and we'll expand on this further later, in Al-Ma'mun's time, that shifts more to Hellenistic culture.
Yeah.
And you see them, essentially rule this entire span of the world, this
Yeah.
part of the world,
Yeah.
and do some pretty impressive things with it. And I knew a lot, I knew some bits and pieces, but piecing it together has just been exhilarating because you realize how many of the broad strokes about them are
Yeah.
just incomplete in the popular imagination.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like, the Abbasids arguably serve as the bridge into modernity from, like, the historic time, the Hellenistic time, the prehistoric, pre-Christ times into modernity. The Abbasids kind of serve as a bridge between that. I would say that they were the first truly global empire because it was also like China had been trading with the rest of the world a little bit, but they weren't fully initiated into the world of trade. It was their confrontation with the Abbasid Caliphate that ended up in like a free trade agreement and like mutual trade, and they kind of brought Chinese goods and Chinese technologies into the Middle Eastern world and then subsequently into Europe. Like paper making technology had existed in China for quite a while, but nowhere else in the world it existed. The Abbasids are the one who really, really got that technology from them, who learned how to do that, and they put it to good use. With the entire
It's really
intellectual
interesting with China
movements,
in
like
particular.
with all the book culture that you had in the Abbasid Caliphate. So they were a very, very forward-looking civilization, and I don't think you have any Renaissance, any Enlightenment, any Industrial Revolution without the basis that
That
was
knowledge
fed
would be
by-
lost.
Yeah, that knowledge would be lost if not for
And
how
despite-
obsessive they were about it.
Despite what happened with Baghdad when it was sacked, pillaged, burned to the ground in 1258, and God knows what we lost.
Yeah.
There. And despite
River
that,
Tigris ran black with the ink of all the books the Mongols dumped into the river.
well, yeah, so let's talk about how the Abbasids came to be.
Yeah. So first we got to get to the Umayyads. Okay, so Umayyads have a little bit of a bad rap, fairly so. They were usurpers. They were quite racist against non-Arab Muslims. They were quite like uninclusive. So a lot of people saw the Umayyads as usurpers. They saw them as like kind of racist against the non-Arab Muslims, particularly the Persians, particularly like the Central Asians, all these different diasporas who had started converting to Islam post Rashidun Caliphate. So the Umayyad end up taking in power. They're quite militaristic. They're kind of the definition of spreading the word by the sword in a lot of ways. It's like comes to the subcontinent because of the Umayyads. Muhammad bin Qasim was an Umayyad general who came on this expedition to Sindh, and he did bring the culture to the religion to this part of the world. The Umayyads made the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Masjid. They weren't as artistically inclined and culturally inclined as the Abbasids, but they still had their role. And it was really under their reign that Islam really, really spread. You know what I mean? By force, by whatever, they spread it all the way from Arabian Peninsula, all the way up to Sindh in the east, and all the way up to the furthest ends of North Africa in the west, all the way up to actually Spain, Cordoba, the Emirate of Cordoba as well. So they were pretty
So you've got this incredibly murky, convoluted legacy left
Yeah.
behind by the Umayyads, because on the one hand, you've done the great gargantuan deed of spreading the word across the world, and at the same time, you've been very heavy-handed.
Yeah.
You have not exemplified the values that were clearly there in the Rashidun Caliphate or in the, you know, uh, pious people after.
Yeah.
Barring some exceptions, of course.
Yeah.
They were.
Got to contend with the stuff they did.
You've got like the Umar bin Abdulazizes, and who had incredible legacies and who are unanimously acknowledged as righteous people and also competent administrators, which is what you look for in a leader, right? And it really begs the question, when we take what kind of approach we take to history,
Yeah.
because we can either make it about individual Umayyad caliphs and try and play God and judge them as good and bad, or we can say we take the phenomenological approach.
Yeah.
We see as phenomena, what did the phenomenon of the Umayyad Caliphate,
Yeah.
as long as it lasted, mean for the world of Islam, stretching into today.
Yeah.
And we know that a lot of the lands today that are Muslim would not have been Muslim without them.
Yeah.
And a large part of their legacy, let me put it this way: just because they didn't embody what an Islamic leader wanted or should have looked like for everyone at the time, doesn't mean that they inadvertently didn't do some things that were useful for the Muslim world in the long run.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think Nietzsche would have loved the Umayyads. Huh? They were the definition of a bunch of master moralists. So, but what they kind of got wrong is that, of course, there is the angle of discrimination against non-Muslims, but more devastating for their reign was their discrimination against non-Arab Muslims, fully convert Muslims, because they applied the jizya tax to non-Arab Muslims as well. They applied the jizya tax for longer periods of time on newly converts. It's like, this is supposed to be a religion for everyone,
and you're not
supposed to charge this tax from these people.
You're not supposed to be judging whether a conversion is sincere or not. That's not your domain.
Yeah.
You're dragging the tax because you're saying that if someone converts, we don't know if it's genuine.
Yeah.
So we're gonna keep taxing them. But like,
that
come
was
on.
Political engineering in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
because these guys were spending like crazy on their empire. They needed a revenue stream, and what governments even to this day do when they need a revenue stream is the laziest thing possible. Is like, let's tax the shit out of the people, and we find an excuse. Either we're doing it for the poor, we're doing it for this, we're doing it for that. Umayyads were no different. So they were quite discriminatory against the non-Arab Muslims, and this created a lot of resentment in the non-Arab Muslims, particularly the Persians, who saw themselves as the progeny of this great, prideful legendary civilization in its own right, which was the Persian Empire, which was the empire of Xerxes, which is the empire of Cyrus the Great.
And
These guys
imagine-
weren't like small fry in their own right. They have a
Imagine
legacy themselves.
You're
You
a
know?
Persian Muslim at that time,
Yeah.
right? And you're every bit as good, as competent, every bit as Muslim as the rulers of the time,
Yeah.
right? You come from a lineage of, say, the Sassanid Empire, where you've
Yeah.
got these competent professional bureaucracies running a massive empire in an incredibly efficient way, and you see in front of you aggressive expansion, which is obviously very impressive.
Yeah.
But there's a point at which the empire begins to quiver.
Yeah.
Because when you're too heavy-handed, when you're too militaristic, when, essentially you haven't learned that you need to replace your militaristic force with a more gentle, wholesome civilian administration,
Yeah.
it is inevitable
Yeah.
that people are going to rise up against you, especially when there are groups, the Abbasids and the Alids, with clear Hashemite lineage,
Yeah.
who people look at as the religious guides, the rightful
inheritors
heirs
of the caliphate. Yeah.
Exactly.
So basically, pretty much of this, according to some of the sources, the text I've read, there was also this feeling amongst the Persians, which are like, man, these Arabs, who are they? They're a bunch of tribal people, and now they're telling us what to
Yeah.
do. And this is a recurring theme, I think, that exists to this day in a lot of ways in the Persian culture, where it's like they're quite prideful. They don't see themselves as taking orders from a bunch of Turks or a bunch of Arabs. It's like, we are the Persians, you know?
But you see, there's this incredible kind of intellectual charity there,
Yeah.
where they're saying that, you know what, Arabs, this idea, this framework, this religion that's come from your part of the world, we actually think these ideas are amazing.
Yeah.
So we're going to take them because
Yeah.
we think this is the good part of you.
Yeah.
But we're not going to take your administration because we think this is the negative part of you.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So they don't have this kind of blind superiority complex.
Yeah.
It's actually quite critical.
No, I agree. Yeah. I mean, it's
I'm not knocking what you're saying. I'm just saying it's like it's an interesting like angle to investigate.
absolutely. I mean, you can kind of compare something like this to, you know, how when America got independent from the British, it's like the British would look at them and be like, hey, listen, yeah, you're cool and all, but we're the fucking British, you know? Cool down on all
Yeah.
this imperialistic, jingoistic talk. Yeah, you're doing well, you've done some nice work, but we're still the fucking British, you know? So there might have been an element of
And
that.
then the
with
Americans
Persian.
take the good from the British, which is
Yeah.
all these Republican values,
Yeah.
and they construct thereafter a similar but much stronger empire over the next 200 years, which is kind of what the Abbasids did as well. So your example comes full circle.
Yeah.
It's like, take the good from the Umayyads, don't take the bad, and then I create what is possibly the greatest empire in worldly terms for sure,
Yeah.
in size, military strength, etc., in the history of the Muslim world.
Arguably, in a lot of ways, yes. So you already have these kind of, you know, grievances against the Umayyads. They've got a lot of different factions who don't really love them. Other than the Arab Muslims, you've got the Khorasanis, you've got the Persians, you've got the Central Asians,
Or the North Africans,
you've got the North Africans.
Western Iraq, all
Yeah.
of these areas are not happy with that.
And what happens is that the clan of the Abbasids kind of position themselves as, you know, let's take advantage in a lot of ways of these grievances. And we also happen to have a better claim over the caliphate.
Yeah.
So what happens is that you have this uprising in Khorasan of the Abbasids. They ally with the Persians, the Alids, with all these different factions. They hit back against the Umayyads.
So you know what's particularly interesting about this era?
Yeah.
Obviously, in hindsight, everything's 2020, and we're
Yeah.
painting out this almost linear narrative of how, it almost seemed inevitable that at
Yeah.
some point the Umayyads were going to be knocked off their perch and the Abbasids were going to take over.
Yeah.
But at the time, a lot of people were taken by surprise because typically the Abbasid branch
Yeah.
of the Hashemite family had been politically quiescent. They had a very lavish palace in Jordan,
Yeah.
at this point called Omema, And they were particularly known for being cooperative, kind, and just they were kind of a high society guiding light. People looked up to them, but they weren't active, and definitely not the way the Alids were,
Yeah.
right? And so when people saw them acting up, and the Alids also joined them, despite conflicting claims for legitimacy over the caliph,
Yeah.
the caliphate, people were quite taken aback at the time.
Yeah.
And other things, and we were talking about this earlier, like imagine this movement's being raised, right?
Yeah.
The Abbasids, with this intense fervor, are coming, they're going across the empire without fear because of their social status, because of the incredible
I mean,
feedback
they
that they're
had
getting.
as much of a blue blood as Umayyads did. It was, in a lot of ways, it was a battle of the elites in a way. You know what I mean? These are,
Islamically, in
Yeah.
terms of claim to the caliphate, they had the bluest blood possible because they had the Hashemite lineage,
Yeah.
right? Which is why people said that the Umayyads are not the rightful heirs, and it should be these guys,
Yeah.
right? And dude, if you've got a conflicting claim with the Alids, but then you also subsume them,
Yeah.
right? And then it gets a lot more interesting, right? Not only did they take the Alid branch of the Abbasid family, they have Nestorian Christians behind them. They have Manichaeists, Buddhists behind them. All of them, because the Umayyads were so heavy-handed with their communities, they saw the relative enlightenment and the promise that the Abbasids brought with them, and they said, you know what, actually,
We're gonna put our horses behind these
we're gonna
guys.
put our horses behind
And
them.
the most interesting about the Abbasids is that, the first person to actually strike for the Abbasids was not one of the original Abbasid caliphs themselves. It wasn't Al-Saffah. It was a guy called Abu Muslim, who was actually one of their supporters, who ran this entire campaign on their behalf in Khorasan to depose the Umayyad governor at the time. So these are really, they had the people's support, man. Like, they weren't even claiming it
They had
themselves.
an incredible amount of motion, and I'm really glad that you brought up Abu Muslim.
Yeah.
Because this again, Abu Muslim is the face of the Dawa, the bond between the non-Arab Muslims and the Abbasid Hashemite household, which ultimately resulted in the creation of the caliphate.
Yeah.
Because this was the first time they've been elevated. They used to call them mawalis,
Yeah.
which in Urdu is now not a very nice word.
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the
It means a
non-Arab,
client, yeah.
the non-Arab Muslims were the mawalis, right? They
Yeah.
were the ajmis, right?
Yeah.
And this is the first time they were given this status, but because of their extraordinary service
Yeah.
to the creation of the caliphate,
Yeah.
they were given like hereditary honors in Al-Saffah's court, and then
Yeah.
going on several generations.
Yeah.
They were given senior military positions when the caliphate was eventually created.
Yeah.
And Abu Muslim, Khurasani, Persian area, right? So these Khurasanis weren't necessarily all of Persian lineage. A lot of them were also
Tajiks and Uzbeks and stuff.
no.
right?
They
That's
were
the
they were
right?
they were Arab. They were original Arabs who had gone to Khorasan and settled there. So the Abna, which was the military and administrative class that later went on to dominate the Abbasid courts, were the Abna. So the Abna were predominantly Arab origin Khorasanis, and then later on, the Persian Khorasanis started to take a more and more active role, which is when you see like the Barmakids and all of these rising up in court and
Yeah.
taking a. But just to top off this incredible motion that the Abbasids had at the dawn of the creation of the caliphate,
Yeah.
there was an earthquake right before the caliphate was pronounced,
Yeah.
right? And 3 or 4 of the most illustrious, opulent courts of the Abbasids extended family around the empire were destroyed.
Umayyad or the Abbasids?
The Umayyads.
Yeah.
The Umayyad family's courts were destroyed by an earthquake. Now imagine,
Yeah.
you're a
And this
people.
is definitely a lot more of a spiritual, superstitious time than we see today. So it's like these guys must have thought like, oh, this is a word from God telling us that
Bro,
these guys are
It's
not worthy.
enough to make anyone feel that way.
Yeah.
Because imagine someone's coming to you preaching revolution, and he's saying it's because God is not happy with them, they do not have a right to rule, and because they're opulent and excessive with their spending.
Yeah.
And then a few days later, all of their most opulent palaces are destroyed in an earthquake.
Yeah.
So of
mean,
course
it's
the
pretty
people were with them. The people were with them.
Yeah. So what ends up happening then is that, okay, the Abbasids end up taking down the Umayyads in a pretty brutal way. I mean, they absolutely bodied them. They ran like a bit of a proto-red. Have you watched Game of Thrones?
I haven't, no.
I think Game of Thrones took half their inspiration from the Abbasids, bro. So basically, they ran kind of like a proto red wedding on them, where it's like they called in like
The banquet.
90 or so Umayyad princes to settle with them to kind of have a peaceful handover of the power. And what did Al-Saffah do? Kills all of them at the banquet.
And you know what they did after?
What?
Apparently,
Yeah,
they took a leather cloth,
yeah,
they put it over all
Yeah.
the Umayyads they just killed,
Yeah.
and they dined on it.
wow.
And you know the one person who escaped, not physically the banquet, but who
Yeah.
didn't show up.
Yeah.
You know who that was? Abdul Rahman the First.
The guy who ended up forming the Emir of Cordoba.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Now imagine, I'm just saying, from a neutral perspective, Muslim world dub,
yeah.
okay, that on the one side your family's getting wiped out,
Yeah.
right? Okay, and even, okay, the Abbasids' greatest op still went and colonized the fuck out of Muslim Spain and basically ordered it.
Yeah,
Just like, yeah, they're at each other's throats, sure.
yeah,
But like several hundred years later, I'm not complaining.
yeah. No, absolutely. It worked for the culture, man. The Umayyads and the Abbasids would meet again in the future. I think it was in Al-Mansur's reign where they butted heads.
There's a
that-
constant noke joke for like
Yep,
1,000 years.
But basically, yeah, the Abbasids ended up taking over the entire Middle East, but that wasn't the end of them. I mean, the Umayyad, that wasn't the end of the Umayyad. They ended up reforming themselves.
They eventually, several hundred years later, when the Abbasids were at a relatively weaker point, they ended up also pronouncing their own caliphate.
Yeah.
But that's actually testimony to the Abbasids because for several hundred years they didn't do that.
Yeah.
They didn't pose a caliphal challenge to them. They simply proclaimed themselves rulers of Cordoba, which is an important distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. So, quite clearly, the early stage Abbasids were pious people, they were good people, but Al-Saffah literally means the bloodthirsty or the bloodletter.
Yeah.
These guys were pretty Machiavellian in their own right, especially with the stuff they did with the Umayyads and stuff. So,
Or
immediately.
what they did with Abu Muslim.
Oh,
Abu Muslim.
Poor Abu Muslim, man.
Abu Muslim, as we just said, Abbas was saying, he is basically the strategic architect of the revolution.
Yeah.
And then one fine day, one of the Abbasid caliphs realizes that his power has gone a little too far.
Was it Al-Saffah or with Al-Mansur? I think it was Al-Mansur.
I think it was Al-Mansur. I think he lasted throughout the reign of the first one. And then when Al-Mansur came into power, he was like, okay, this guy's influence has gone way too far. Because essentially, he was calling all the shots in the east.
Yeah.
Right? Khorasan was all Abu Muslim territory to the point that if the caliph needed anything done, he would kind of have to go through Abu Muslim.
Yeah.
So what he does is, and this is about as Machiavellian as it gets, and it makes you question the whole pious narrative, where he... Abu Muslim is going on a campaign, and after they've had a little tiff, I think, but then he says, no, come back, let's settle this, let's talk about this. You've been with our family for so long. The moment Abu Muslim comes back, the caliph's soldiers restrain him, order a complete sham trial, and execute him on the spot. So that is what becomes of the architect of the Abbasid revolution.
Yeah. They're pretty brutal. So Al-Saffah. Right after he beats the Umayyads, he's caliph. He immediately turns his eyes towards the east with expanding Tang dynasty in China, and he's like, okay, we can't let we just took down the Umayyads. We can't let the Chinese take over Central Asia. So he sends an army, goes to meet them in war, manages to beat them, which is pretty impressive. I mean, you took down two big empires pretty within a few years of each other. But unlike, I would say, I mean, given the Umayyads and their nature, they would have probably used that opportunity to, hey, we beat them, why don't we expand further east?
Yeah.
Let's take China, let's make China Muslim. You know what I mean? So the Abbasids don't have this type of heavy-handed approach. So, and this is characterized by later of the rule as well. Their idea isn't that, we want to
Absolutely.
take over their land. We don't need to impose anything on you Chinese that we don't want to. It'll probably be too costly towards us. We won the battle in Central Asia. We don't have to expand eastward. So what we're going to do is that we can trade China. Let's work together. And they actually became allies at a certain point. So what happens is that the Tang dynasty at a certain point was dealing with an internal rebellion. And what does Al-Saffah do? He sends his troops to help the Tang dynasty to turn down the rebellion. So he was a very, very shrewd political operator. He's like, let us have control over the Silk Road. We control the trade routes. We will trade with you, and we will support you in your internal rebellions as well. We don't have to impose our culture on you. And this was a very, very smart decision, because what happens is that they kind of inaugurate China into the new world, into the world of trade. They get paper making technology from China. They're importing Chinese silk. So the Abbasid Caliphate becomes kind of like proto globalization in the way where they are facilitating a bunch of trade between Europe and China. Is running to Abbasids, and they become rich because of this.
And bro, you know, the stats on this are insane.
Yeah.
I think by the early 10th century, so that's maybe about 150 years later,
Yeah.
Gongju had 120,000 international traders.
Yeah.
And some of the anecdotes about this are actually really funny. So, for example, when the Abbasid traders would take some exotic commodity or animal to China, they would lie about the origin. So, if there was some kind of
cool dog.
yeah, I guess, or there's some kind of fabric,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And the Tang would ask them, that, oh, how can we get this fabric? The Abbasid traders would say, actually, there's a specific type of animal that can only be reared and cared for in our part of the world, and we can't bring it here or it'll die. The moment he crosses this line, he's going to die. Okay, and the Tang would be like, oh, no.
Oh, shit.
Oh, shit. And imagine, at that time, the Tang, throughout this period, used to impose a 30% duty on goods leaving the port. And yet they were a center of commerce for the entire world, enabled by the Abbasids. And to give you an idea of how far the currency went, bro, apparently as early as 780, so that's 30 years into the Caliphate, Abbasid coins dated to 780 have been found in northern Russia.
Wow.
They've been found in the Baltic Sea. There's this famous shipwreck between Sumatra and Java, which is dated to the Abbasid trade of back then.
Yeah.
So these guys were out there.
Yeah, they were traders. They were making business. They were making money. They were the richest empire in the world at this point. And like, unlike the Umayyads, who were like focusing on an expansion, the Abbasids were really characterized by consolidation.
Absolutely.
How can we make what we already have stronger and more functional and richer? And some of the regions that benefited most from this were obviously the Khorasan region. The Arabs already had money, but also that entire Iraq, that Middle East.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's where they decide, okay, look, we need a new capital. We're not going to use the capital of Damascus of Syria. So we need a new capital. And this is where Al-Mansur, I think Al-Mansur is the one who founded Baghdad, right? Yeah. So they look at this piece of land, extremely agricultural, fertile land, lying right between the Tigris and the Euphrates. It's got mountains to the north, so there's a bit of geographical realism where it's like, okay, this is a defendable position, and they found the city of Baghdad over there to be the capital of the place.
What I really admire about Al-Mansur's founding of Baghdad is he looks at the previous empire. I think it was Sassanids, might be wrong. Their capital, Ctesiphon, and Baghdad is only a few kilometers away from there.
Yeah.
But he says that, no, I want this particular spot. I'm going to create my perfect round mandala hearkening city.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And a very interesting anecdote. Apparently on the eve of when the Caliph was going to decide when to begin the construction of Baghdad, he convened a court of astrologers where he had a Christian astrologer, a Muslim one, and I believe either a Sabian or a Zoroastrian one. And they together told him an inaugural date for the city, which again just speaks to the fact that although Al-Mansur was very much an Orthodox Muslim, he was accommodative of the different peoples of his reign. They had a place in his court, and he was open to all of these ideas that were dominant or prominent in the ancient Indian or Near Eastern sciences. Right. So that's a kind of, you can have a value judgment on that, sure, but the guy was in that sense progressive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Al-Mansur is actually really the one who we were referring to, the Umayyads' heavy-handed militaristic approach. So Al-Mansur is the one who really brought that Persian-style bureaucracy into the empire, and he wanted to professionally run in a lot of ways
Yeah.
his empire, and that's what Baghdad was actually originally made for. Just
Exactly.
like, I'm going to house my bureaucracy here, I'm going to make this the center of intellectual and governing life of the empire.
और bro सोचो,
Yeah,
bro, in 2025,
yeah,
half of Karachi is कच्ची आबादीज.
yeah,
Okay, हमें ये नहीं पता कि कोई बच्चा ड्रेनेज के अंदर गिर जाएगा.
yeah.
And back then, in the late in the late 8th century, late 8th
700s,
century,
yeah.
Al-Mansur is making a city
Yeah.
where to this day we know where the market was.
Yeah.
We know where the date palm fields were.
Yeah.
We know where the river was supposed to run and who was supposed to cross it when.
Yeah.
This guy is an exemplar of, not just forget Muslim civilization, of how any city should be made or run.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah. And one thing that's also really important with Al-Mansur is that, bro, the guy was a frugal guy, bro. He did not, he apparently, never got himself new clothes. He was, repairing his old clothes and stuff. He looked at every bit of expenditure. He was running it, no waste allowed.
He has a specific quote. He says that if I stopped collecting taxes today,
yeah.
the Bait al-Mal could run this entire empire for 10 years.
Yeah. So here's, once again, it's their reaction to the Umayyads in a lot of ways, in the sense that, hey, listen, we don't want to have to rely on too much tax and stuff to fund the stuff we're doing. They were quite frugal. They didn't do wasteful spending. They spent very, very intelligently. Al-Mansur would look after the finances himself of every project down to every penny. He would be doing quantity surveying way before quantity surveying was a thing. He was looking at how much wood, how much cement, how much stone do I need to make this little building? And he would be counting each tile himself. So a very, very diligent guy,
and
a very, very frugal guy, but a very, very good financial operator as well.
And this reflected on, because obviously ultimately the thing that made the unique feature of the caliphate was that it merged religious and secular roles of governance and kingship with religious authority and rulership. And you see there that Al-Mansur, in good measure, performs his religiosity publicly. He leads the Muslims in pilgrimage every year. He takes advantage.
Friday prayer
leads a Friday prayer. He takes advantage of the fact, rightfully so, that the Abbasid family was charged with the incredible honor of providing water from the well of Zamzam to pilgrims every year. So he took that line and performed that action as well. So, and I don't think this was insincerely, right? The guy was clearly devoted to the governance that you just talked about, and also the faith-based side of things, which is why ultimately I think he stands out as an exemplary caliph because he took on both roles. There's there was a particular year of drought during Al-Mansur's reign. And there's an anecdote, again, these, apocryphal tales, you don't know whether they're true or not. There's a historical account where there are people gathered under his balcony, and he comes out on the balcony, looks up at the clouds, and the people down below are praying for rain. He looks up at the clouds and he says, go where you wish, east or west, and bless the land with rain. It doesn't matter. East or west, wherever you go, it will be my empire that you rain down upon. It will be my empire that goes crops through it, and ultimately the taxes will come back to me. Okay. So Al-Mansur had aura. Al-Mansur was sufficiently militaristic, and I know the true. He took on the mantle of Abu Muslim in fortifying the institution of the caliphate and the empire both. So in that way, I think he's a exceptional leader.
And we talk about the frugality, but a big reason behind a lot of the frugality that he was engaging in, he was trying to be smart with the money and stuff, is because he was spending money on one thing that nobody ever. I mean, Umayyads did a little bit, but not to the extent that he did, which was on intellectual development. The translation movement started with him. So the guy spent huge amounts of sum importing books, importing, different manuscripts from Egypt, from India, from all the neighboring regions to have them transcribed into Arabic, there was this anecdote I read. It was scholars in the Abbasid Caliphate were superstar sportsmen are in the world today. Like they were going around the world recruiting these guys. Come over, we will pay you extremely handsomely. Why don't you guys translate these works for us? Why don't we get smarter? And this entire translation movement is really what set the stage for the Bayt al-Hikmah. You'll see it later, but there's a clear intellectual proclivity about Al-Mansur's reign, and that I would say is the defining characteristic of the Abbasids in a lot of way. What what we still talk about them to this very
No,
day. And that's Al-Mansur's legacy.
And his the Abbasids in general, like I spoke about, the city planning, for example, you spoke about their accounting. At one point, I'm forgetting where in the empire, but Ibn Khordadwi, hopefully I'm pronouncing his name, wrote this book called Routes and Realms, where he basically maps out the entirety of the empire, their population, their natural resources, what animals you find there, everything.
Yeah.
Right? Bro, in 2026, we do not know the population of Karachi, bro.
Yeah.
Someone says 14 million, someone says 20 million, someone says
25 million.
Someone says 25 million, which is probably true.
Yeah.
Right? And back then, these guys, bro, the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics could learn a thing or two from the Abbasid Caliphate because these guys were on it. And information is the number one tool you need to govern.
Yeah.
And you see this with Al-Mansur, you see this Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid actually is supposed to have been the one who really built this out, and we'll come to him later. But his postal service that spanned the length of the empire was the proto-information system that he used. And he wasn't. Harun al-Rashid was not Bill Gates, who went on a game show. You ask him how much does a carton of milk cost, he wouldn't know. Apparently, weekly, he would get letters from his governors that would have all the price lists of every province there. And then he would write back commenting, okay, you changed this one this much. Like, that's the extent to which he was known to, in a positive way, micromanage.
Al-Mansur.
This is Harun al-Rashid.
This is Harun al-Rashid. Yeah. Okay. So moving on to Harun al-Rashid, like he's probably the most famous out of all the caliphs. Like he is like the main character of the Arabian Nights, which so captured Western imaginations. And I think in a lot of ways he's kind of overrated.
I actually don't think so.
Yeah.
But okay. So legacy-wise, you talk about the Arabian Nights references.
Yeah.
Bro, Yeats, Henry Wadsworth. And I'm not making an argument of authority, but hear me out.
Yeah.
All these guys harp on Harun al-Rashid's legacy.
Yeah.
Right? And they talk about his golden refrain. Yeah. Did you know this is incredible? Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous 20th century architect, wrote to the Iraqi Development Board in the 1960s with plans for a new, greater, renewed Baghdad because he was so inspired by the image of Harun al-Rashid in history.
Yeah.
This is one of the greatest architects of the past ever.
Yeah.
He drew plans for a renewed circular Baghdad, and in the center of the city, he wanted to place a statue of Harun al-Rashid, which he wanted to liken to the Statue of Liberty in New York.
Wow.
So that's the kind of aura Harun al-Rashid has.
Yeah.
And in broad strokes, we'll get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
But the reason I think that Harun al-Rashid absolutely exemplifies what a Abbasid Caliph was is because in his earlier years, even while he was a prince, he led military campaigns himself. And on an occasion or two, when intervention was
needed. He led military campaign himself, but a lot of the military establishment didn't really take him that seriously.
But that also evolves throughout the course of his reign, because initially in his reign, the Barmakids, which is a family that rose to prominence under Al-Mahdi and Al-Hadi, the two caliphs before him, in the first, I think from 797 to 803, the first 7 years of his reign are dominated by Yahya bin Khalid, who was the patriarch of the Barmakids, and his two sons, Al-Fadl and Jafar. And it's said that they run the caliphate. So at that point, you're right to say that Harun al-Rashid is not taken as seriously as he should be.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that, like, his time did mark the pinnacle of the empire, but I don't know how much of that was him and how much of that was the kind of the policies laid out by Al-Saffah and Al-Mansur before him. Like,
I
I think he was in a great place at a great time to a lot of degrees. Like, what Harun al-Rashid is arguably most known for is his luxurious spending more than anything.
okay,
Like,
so
his
I don't
wife
agree with
had,
this.
like, entire dresses made out of diamonds and stuff. He was kind of the poster child for that Umayyad exuberance that the Abbasids came in as a reaction to in a lot of ways, where it's super sexy, it's super flashy, it's luxurious, it's like glamorous, but I'm not sure about it from
Okay, okay,
Abbasid Caliph
okay. Let me.
perspective.
So he had the military angle,
Yeah,
and later he strengthens it. Even as he is, even while he was caliph,
yeah,
we can confirm whether this was before or after the Barmakids. But there were two campaigns, if I remember correctly. We can put them, some up. Uh, when his military commanders could not manage them, he personally intervened and pushed them through.
okay,
So I would say he's got the military thing down.
okay.
The administration part as well. The Barmakids, once they were ousted, people were like, "Oh,
I mean, he ousted them.
he ousted them. He
Yeah,
ousted.
yeah,
He turned on them and
he,
ousted
he
them.
flipped on them.
They were the most efficient administrators the empire had seen until that point. But also at that point, everyone was critical, saying that, "Oh, how is he going to run the empire now?" And then he goes on to do a 6-year masterclass
Yeah.
until the end of his caliphate.
Yeah.
Right. So he has a dual merit of knowing how to run a bureaucracy or delegating, and also micromanaging and do it himself. And finally, there are two more things that I really give him credit for. They're mostly just one. He balanced the sentiments of the population and the intellectuals incredibly well. So he does all the public performance of religion in a positive way, right? And maintains a lot of popular support. And the kind of intellectual inquiry that goes on in Harun al-Rashid's time, which is more influenced by classic ideas of India and of Egypt, as opposed to the Hellenistic ideas that come in later under Al-Ma'mun. They make a great deal of progress on math, geography, and all this, and he does this.
Yeah, I mean, he was sponsored, like, the Bayt al-Hikmah really came, the project, like, I mean, Al-Mansur started the intellectual movement, but the Bayt al-Hikmah is
He
Harun
does this.
al-Rashid's project, so I have to always give him props
He
for the
does
Bayt
this.
al-Hikmah.
He does this without the Inquisition-style repression of Al-Ma'mun later,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that, and then finally, and then another incredible thing, it is Tang China. We know about Tang China's relationship with the Abbasids, not because we know, but not because the Abbasids wrote about it.
Yeah.
We know because Tang China, in the time of Harun al-Rashid specifically, wrote about an Abbasid embassy in China. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
I didn't know
and which speaks volumes, in my opinion, and my takeaway from that was that the peak of Chinese and of Tang Chinese and Abbasid trade was enabled by Harun al-Rashid, and which is why they felt compelled to write detailed historical accounts about how incredible his embassy was, and how repeated trips from that part of the world yielded the most exotic, the most valuable goods one could possibly imagine. And from my understanding is that the Abbasids are trading before that, but it is in Harun al-Rashid's era that the chart starts going like asymptotic.
Yeah.
So I won't necessarily
his
say
development in terms of trade, the development of textiles, metal goods, paper, generally, like, yeah, all kudos to him in that type of
so.
stuff.
My
Can't
ultimate
take
case
credit
is
for that.
I'm not necessarily saying I don't have the depth of knowledge about the Abbasids yet to say that he was the best,
Yeah.
but absolute like top tier ruler in my
Yeah, he's the top three. He has to be top three.
yeah.
What about his succession planning, Al-Amin Al-Ma'mun?
Oh, actually, you know what? If
That wasn't
anything
great.
is gonna bump him down from like an S to an A,
Yeah.
that his succession planning was such a massive.
I think
fuck up.
his succession planning is kind of a testament to the idea that, man, the guy, because a lot of people say that, he really didn't have as much power as he made it out to be. It's just that he inherited the kingdom at its best possible time, So it's like he wanted Al-Ma'mun to be his successor, but Al-Ma'mun was the son of a Persian concubine. Al-Amin was the son of, he was pure Abbasid blood. Al-Amin was Al-Mansur's grandson from both sides. So Al-Amin is as pure blooded as it gets, but he wanted Al-Ma'mun to be his successor. But to make the the court happy, he had to name Al-Amin as the initial successor, and
So the
Al-Ma'mun is
arrangement-
like the spare. It's like an heir and a spare, and Al-Ma'mun is the spare.
I mean,
So he couldn't really
so-
even go through on the guy he wanted.
So
to
what
succeed him.
happened with Al-Ma'mun in particular and the split
Yeah.
was that when they drafted the document,
Yeah.
they basically said that yes, Al-Amin is the caliph,
Yeah.
but Al-Ma'mun takes precedence in the eastern provinces,
Yeah.
which is just, I really think that this is why my opinion on this thing kind of differs. I think that this was very much a Harun al-Rashid type of move,
Yeah.
but I think he over-intellectualized it. And people will say, oh, even the greatest rulers fall prey to succession planning.
Yeah.
And I'll say, yeah, because that's the most obvious and easiest thing that you can fall for.
Yeah.
And Harun al-Rashid fell for it,
Yeah.
right? But you know, the equivalent of appointing Al-Amin caliph of the realm and appointing Al-Ma'mun at least taking precedence in the eastern provinces is like someone said,
You're setting up your empire to get broken up.
bro, the analogy I would use
Yeah.
is imagine someone made you Prime Minister of Pakistan and they said, Momi, you're actually going to be Chief Minister of Punjab, Sindh, and KP.
Yeah.
And if Arbaz wants to do anything, he has to ask you first.
Yeah.
So to just give you guys context of how messed up this situation was,
Yeah.
that's kind of what it looked like.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the Khorasanis were most influential at court, right? Increasingly,
They were the richest.
they were the richest. And in every single time Iraq failed to give the taxes that they ideally wanted, Khorasan's covering their ass,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And imagine, like, you give that to someone else. So
To the spare. And I think this dualism between Persian and because what Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun really comes down to is a battle between Arabic and Persian influence in the caliphate. So, the official stance is Arab, you got the Persian lobbying on one side through Al-Ma'mun. And I would say that one weakness of the Abbasid Caliphate, and this is a recurring theme, is that, okay, they're good at uniting everyone, but unlike the Umayyads who would have just come in and been like, okay, I don't have time for your this is this, no two ways about
wrap it up. This guy's your governor and he's going to stay there for 20 years.
Yeah, and if you disagree with me, I'm going to cut all your heads off. The Abbasids were kind of people pleasers. It's like we're going to praise the Arabs, we're going to praise the Khorasanis, later we're going to praise the Turks. It's like you can't kind of pray,
But wouldn't
please
you say-
everyone,
wouldn't
Like
you say
Harun
that's the
al-Rashid,
reason?
if he was the great leader that he is, which I'm sure he was, but I think that, his administrative structure was brilliant more than him being a great leader. It's like, bro, then go with the guy who you think is more competent. And your call was right. Al-Amin was not all that. Al-Ma'mun was,
Yeah,
for the most part,
yeah.
a great leader.
Agreed.
So your instinct was right. But then at least have the courage to kind of go up against the Arab elite and be like, listen, man, this guy's just better. And go with it. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be an ethnic partisan decision.
So I'll ask you this.
yeah.
This was obviously the wrong decision.
Yeah.
And I think Harun al-Rashid had the stature as a caliph
Yeah.
that he could have pushed the decision through.
Yeah.
Right? But this tendency, and in Pakistan we call it mufahamat, right?
Okay.
Compromise, right? This tendency of compromise. Do you think that this was all bad? Because the way I see it is the political tendency, along with the nature of the institution of the caliphate, that continually allowed the caliphate to bounce back over 500 years, was this tendency that the Abbasids had to have a big tent coalition,
Yeah.
right? And yes, the Umayyads conquered, they were strict, and they had a harrowing amount of control almost on their territories. A lot of the times the Abbasids are just going there, they have protectorates
Yeah.
for a fixed
They have
tribute.
sub-governors. That's why you have all these extremely powerful sub-dynasties that are forming in
And
their
it's tiers,
territory.
huh? So you've got governorates,
Yeah.
you've got protectorates, you've got simple tribute paying states, and dude, these structures are actually really f***ing complex. Like, you had these basic states, which were actually the frontier provinces a lot of the time, or the more difficult to manage provinces who had stronger local dynasties, were paying fixed tributes.
Yeah.
Right? What that did was that anything made over and above them, they didn't have to pay back to the central treasury of the caliph.
Yeah.
Right? But the particular provinces where they had a variable rate arrangement, and this is so complex for the time, they basically said that we're going to take it proportionally. So what they would then do is basically what the IMF does with like every third world country around the world.
Yeah.
They sent their accountants and their economists to that province who would keep an active eye on the tax revenues being collected every year.
Yeah.
And then that a proportion of that amount would go back to the central treasury of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Yeah.
And this is what allowed them to exert a varying amount of influence. So the variable rate, the proportional payers, they had a lot more influence on because they had their staff stationed there inside their finance ministry of the time, their Baitul Mals.
Yeah.
With the as opposed to the tribute paying, it is like the Abbasid Caliphate has given me, you know, my they used to call it the Abbasid investiture, which was the right to rule, right? And I think we should actually clarify that a little bit. That'll be really important. A lot of the writers of the time have compared the authority of the Abbasid Caliph to the Christian Pope.
Yeah.
The reason being, just the way that different rulers of different territories took like a papal edict which allowed them or gave them the blessing to rule over that area. This is exactly what the Abbasid Caliph would do as well. So, which is what allowed in the long run for the caliphate to stay a legitimate institution. Because even if people wanted to depose an individual caliph, they didn't want to get rid of the caliphate. Because if they had the power to replace a caliph and put their own person in charge, what they really wanted was this shadow of God on earth to give them his blessing in ruling X territory.
Yeah. Look, I'm not disputing with all their administrative skills. It was definitely there. I think for the most part, the Abbasids did a lot of good. I just think with some of these matters, they should have been a bit more heavy-handed. Because, I mean, even if you look at what happened later on, if you see what happened later on, like, you know, you've got the Fatimids breaking off and creating their own little sub-caliphate in northern Egypt.
Egypt, yeah.
Yeah, you've got, like, you know, the Umayyads who end up, like, you know, becoming puppet masters of the Abbasids at a certain point, you know.
Yeah.
You've got the Seljuk Turks at a certain point who, you know, kind of go rogue and start doing their own thing. The Abbasids' reluctance to kind of centralize the power a bit more, kind of raise their own army. Instead, you know, you have a bunch of these governors who are like, hey, listen, you raise your own private armies. You manage this, you manage that. They should have probably focused on a little bit more central power. And like for all the innovation they did intellectually and culturally, they should have probably been at the forefront of military innovation as well.
Okay, I actually don't agree at all. Because
I mean, they quite literally ended up being made puppets by
no, sure, but they did have a standing army. Al-Motasim's raising of Turkish slave brigades.
But that's exactly the problem, you know. Al-Motasim is a great example you give of exactly this policy. Is because it's like they're not raising their own standing army, so you have one of the princes who spends all of his allowance on buying Turkic slave warriors to make his own little private army that ends up becoming a little bit of a pain in the ass for you later, because it's like, bro, the caliphate does not have its own standing military. The one guy who makes a standing military is Al-Motasim. And what happens is that when he dies, that Turkish military of slave nomads who have no connection to the land, they're not loyal to anyone. They're just going to carve out their own little...
No, it's even worse than that. No, I'll tell you.
Run their own shit.
I'll tell you why I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
And why it's even worse. Because it is those same Turkish military men that later start assassinating and replacing caliphs.
Yeah.
In quick succession. There's actually
Anarchy of Samara. Yeah.
Bro, there's a really interesting anecdote about where one of the caliphs is drunk out of his mind and is having a masquerade ball at one of his very luxurious palaces.
Yeah.
And one of these Egyptian military men barges in with a small brigade, and the party goers are so drunk, they think it's a joke.
Yeah.
Until the point that colonel or whatever the rank was comes and stabs the caliph in the heart, they all think it's a part of some elaborate showmanship, right? But my point being, I agree with you. I'll tell you where I agree with you. That they should have had a native standing army, yes. But a standing army they did have. And the standing army is... I'm not going to say that everyone agrees that it's the sole reason, but most scholars agree that it is a major reason why they were financially drained. And okay, and you know, this is what I keep coming back to. And my takeaway from what I've read is that the Abbasid Caliphate, every single time it wavers and becomes smaller, is usually due to the fact that they have looser control at home. So in Iraq, either there's a succession battle or they have had a bad harvest and they've run a bad harvest and they haven't been able to collect the tax revenue that they wanted to, right? Because in later years, that does start to dry up in Iraq. And that coincides with every negative turn in the fate of the Abbasids. And that draining of financial resources is exacerbated. And even though I'm thoroughly impressed by the bureaucracy, right? But when you have a bureaucracy that's spread out so far and wide, it does increase transaction costs. They manage this to some extent when they have local governorships and, individual rulerships. But when you're consistently carrying out military campaigns, even if not for expansion, right?
I mean, their military campaigns were basically like exercises on the Eastern Roman Empire's border with Anatolia. It's like they're just gonna go there, practice a little bit, which I actually think was a smart move. It's like,
the problem there.
keep the military battle hardened, give people a bit of a show. Hey, we took all these lands and this booty away from the Eastern Romans. But I don't know.
But at some point, it kind of begins to backfire because if you're already, if you have an overstaffed army, if they're making more and more demands, right? You've got this financial drainage. On this one side, you've got Iraq not yielding the same kind of revenues that it did once upon a time. And then what you're doing is, because you've got to say what has consistently happened, and this has happened in 2 or 3 cycles with the Abbasids. That one region will fall. For example, Ifriqiya, which is Tunisia, etc., or Egypt, that falls, right? And you've got less tax revenue. So what you start doing is you start farming taxes from the frontier regions, which you have the least control over in the first place. That increases discontent, and that the Byzantines or some other Eastern force, it was varyingly the Byzantines.
We've kind of critically engaged with the rise of the Abbasids and the fall of the Umayyads, Al-Saffah's legacy, Al-Mansur's legacy, Harun al-Rashid's legacy. Mostly a lot of good, a few negatives here and there, but we're nitpicking for the most part up until this point. This is like by far the greatest Islamic civilization, the 3-4 caliph stretch we can think of. And now the guy who comes after this is actually not one guy. It's not Al-Ma'mun yet. It's actually Al-Amin first. So this was the blunder of Harun al-Rashid that we were referring to. So put in short, Al-Amin is the original successor. The line of succession is supposed to go from him to Al-Ma'mun. This was a contentious topic for Al-Amin. So Al-Amin rips up the contract that his father signed in the Kaaba, actually, which says Al-Amin is my heir, then it's going to be Al-Ma'mun. So he rips up the contract, goes blazing against Al-Ma'mun. And this is actually quite a very, very interesting civil war that happens, because at the time, Al-Ma'mun is much weaker than Al-Amin when the war starts. So what happened is that Al-Ma'mun was centered Khorasan. All the Khorasani military was called back to Baghdad by Al-Amin. Al-Amin had all the money, most of the military, everything. But through Al-Ma'mun and his main generals, the Khorasanis, his elite, his court, they engineered a way. Long story short, they crushed Al-Amin. They killed Al-Amin. Al-Ma'mun becomes the leader. So for the first few years of his caliphate, he did not move to Baghdad, actually. He stayed in Khorasan.
Just to add, what I find really interesting, and I have no counterfactuals to give to the account that you just gave of Al-Amin versus Al-Ma'mun, but it made me think about a particular aspect of history and historiography. So the Tarikh-e-Tabari, which documents all of this and is supposed to be the most comprehensive view of what has happened in this time, was written essentially by the winning side. So a lot of the critical accounts are like, of course they're going to portray Al-Ma'mun in a more favorable light. And of course Al-Amin is going to be the usurper who's not even respecting his brother's rights in Khorasan. But it's worth thinking about. But then it's also, sometimes you just don't know. You just have to run with this.
History is written by the winners at the end of the day, So Al-Ma'mun's point of view is going to be told. But I think there is a balance to be struck, because like I said, most of the Baghdadi elite was Al-Amin's inner circle, and they had more access to the scholars and the written word at the time. So there was quite a bit of pushback on Al-Ma'mun. He is the most controversial caliph,
Yeah.
one of the most controversial caliphs. So while I do think there was probably an Al-Ma'mun bias simply because he won, I think the history book shows him to be a much more polarizing character
And a much more
compared to, let's,
competent figure as well.
huh?
A much more competent figure as
A
well.
much more competent figure as well. And I mean, I personally find it very, very fascinating. So, the first couple of years of his caliphate, he did not even want to go to Baghdad. He was happy with his Green Army in Khorasan.
Huh.
He liked staying over there. So, once again,
And the Green Army bit is important. But
yeah. It's important,
Yeah.
firstly, because you Game of Thrones gooners who are watching House of Dragons right now can relate to the Greens versus the Blacks. Well, the inspiration for the Greens and the Blacks, I think, is probably found in the Abbasid Civil War, where it was Al-Amin's side was the Blacks, which was the national color of the Abbasids, which symbolized Baghdad and, the Arabic Persian elite that made Baghdad, and the green symbolized Al-Mamun's faction, which was the Khorasanis.
And this was kind of a repeat in spirit of the original overthrow of the Umayyads by the Abbasids, because the original Abbasid revolution co-opted Ali's favoring fervor
Yeah,
to overthrow the caliphate of the time.
yeah,
And then Al-Ma'mun does the same thing by adopting the green, which is most strongly associated with that Ali fervor,
yeah.
and taking that and then toppling the central government and taking over.
The blacks, yeah.
Yeah.
And when he finally moved to Baghdad, like, I think like his entire court, all of his boys were all wearing green, and like he had to be pressured into, listen, bro, you are now the caliph. You've got to wear black. This is how we do things. It's not just about you. It's about ek tarika hai hamara. You know what I mean? So when he started wearing black, but this entire story is still a footnote to what Al-Mamun's reign was really
absolutely.
about, where Al-Mamun was like the nerdiest caliph ever. And he was the most headstrong caliph ever as well. So this guy, like, in the middle of his reign, he's like, yeah, I own Egypt. What's underneath the pyramids, by the way? What's inside the pyramid? So I'm gonna make expensive ass tunnels underneath the pyramids to find books. I want to see what's in there. Like there's a lot of the war, like the battles they used to fight against the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Europe, Roman Empire. So in one of the treaties, he's like, "Listen, Romans, I don't need anything from you. Give me all your books." You know the story?
He specifically asked for Ptolemy's geography.
Yeah, he specifically asked for certain books. He told them, "Listen, empty out your libraries. Give me all your manuscripts. Give me all this stuff." He, I think, more symbolizes and manifests this Abbasid fervor for learning and knowledge more than anyone else. It was under his direct patronage that Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, algorithms overall was, his work blossomed. This guy tried to calculate the circumference of the world using stadiums or something. Like he
commissioned Musa bin Shakir to estimate the circumference of the world.
Yeah.
And he was within 92 miles. So the difference is 24,000 and 24,092.
Yeah.
Imagine.
Yeah. So he was, the granddaddy of intellectual patronage in the Abbasid Caliphate. Where he does get a bit controversial is, I'm going to let you expound on this.
Man, so what you see, and this is where I think I was misled. Let's talk about the popular discourse around the Abbasids for a second and their learning.
Yeah.
Everyone's always talking about they led the translation movement.
Yeah.
There was a major turn from Indian and Egyptian scholarship towards Hellenistic scholarship.
Yeah.
So translating Plato, translating Aristotle. That's why you see such a heavy imprint to this day, but of those philosophers then, of Aristotelian thinking, of Platonic thinking, right?
So Al-Ma'mun was the one who really brought in Hellenistic philosophy.
But the House of Wisdom, as we know it,
the
House of Wisdom was a creation of Al-Ma'mun. All the intellectuals pursuits existed before him, but in that form, that was a doing of Al-Ma'mun.
Yeah.
And the issue then became that his I don't know, Hellenophile, is that the word?
Yeah.
His fascination with the Hellenistic culture went so deep that he began a crackdown and active repression of the more orthodox Muslim thinkers that existed before his time.
Yeah.
So the biggest names you can think of, like Imam Abu Hanifa, Ahmed bin Hanbal, these stalwarts of who are
Islamic jurisprudence.
yeah, they're of the big 4 or 5, right? These towering personalities actively opposed the reign of Al-Ma'mun and his successors, to the point that Imam Abu Hanifa died in captivity because he refused to affirm specific teachings that Al-Ma'mun wanted to propagate.
Yeah.
And people always bring it back to 1 or 2 particularly contentious issues between the ulama of the time and Al-Ma'mun. But the debate was, I think, those issues were weaponized by Al-Ma'mun in order to further his overall religious agenda. Because what was kind of happening is that he saw that the canon of knowledge that these orthodox thinkers, these ulama, have built up is what's being used to interpret Islamic thought one particular way.
Yeah.
Right? So it wasn't necessarily that he had one disagreement with them, it was this entire process, that this hegemony of interpreting Islamic ideas, which he did not want to go anywhere but the caliphal.
Yeah, so there was a
the caliphal
political
ground.
side to this kind of persecution he had against the orthodoxy as well, where he wanted matters of Islamic jurisprudence to lie in the hands of the caliph, not just the imam. He wanted to kind of merge the functions of the imam and the caliph.
And this actually speaks to his Persian heritage as well,
Yeah.
because one of the great thinkers, Ardeshir of the Sasanian Empire, specifically said kingship and religion are like twins. So this line of thinking that the priest king was the ultimate authority in this area predated the existence of a caliph.
Yeah.
Right? This was there in the Persian empires as well.
Yeah.
So when he comes, and when the caliphate comes around and tries to merge these roles, and Al-Ma'mun does it most decisively,
Yeah.
because he's disrupting the most.
Yeah.
Obviously it was going to rub a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah.
And they call it the Minha,
Minha.
which
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
which is it's basically a soft inquisition,
Yeah.
right? It's an all-out assault, and this is so ironic because you would imagine that someone who proclaims the ideas of Aristotle and Plato and sits in Platonic fashion over a court of debating intellectuals would be in favor of freedom of speech.
He imprisoned most of the orthodox scholars of the time,
Exactly.
the leading thinkers of the time.
And it goes further. It's even darker than that, because he that's an assault on freedom of expression.
Yeah.
It becomes an out and out assault on freedom of conscience and of thought. Because if you want to be a judge, if you want to hold high public office, you don't have to just.
You have to affirm his own personal
Exactly.
views. Yeah.
He's not saying, "Oh, don't speak out against me."
Yeah.
He's saying, actively affirm exactly what I'm saying. And he's taking these 1 or 2 really controversial, non-mainstream creeds. He's carving them into the faces of mosques, right?
Yeah.
And he's trying to enforce this on people, and of course, it's not working.
Yeah.
And
The
perhaps
orthodoxy was still hugely popular. Like people
it was
mostly
more
liked the-
popular.
Yeah.
As it happens everywhere, when the establishment or the powerful crack down beyond a certain extent, the grassroots
People are
starts to become popular.
going to start push back. And the funny thing about this is that, like, and this rings true to this very day. We see this in the world today as well, where it's like, if you're going to try it, if the institutions ever try to really silence a certain voice and a certain line of thinking, that just empowers that line of thinking. Where it's like, look, we are being cracked down because we are the suzerains of what is righteous and what is true. We kind of see, like, in a lot of ways, Al-Ma'mun was like proto-liberal hegemony thought police.
Oh, absolutely.
Where it's like, yeah, I am the most intellectually inclined, I am the most scientifically inclined, but if you disagree with my orthodoxy, I will socially and professionally
I will
annihilate
ostracize you. I will
have you ostracize you, I will have you sent to
imprison
jail.
you.
Yeah, so he kind of ran like a 1984 type thought police type thing, kind of like, what we see with the liberal hegemony, what we talk about with some of the people that we deal with in the world today. So a lot of the things that rang true in his time still ring true today. And him and his successive caliphs continued this persecution against the orthodoxy, and I think it was under al-Mutawakkil's rule that it finally stopped. And what happens then is that the orthodoxy become very, very powerful after that. Like, I think there's a specific point where the orthodoxy, Al-Ghazali, a lot of these thinkers got very, very powerful, and I don't think that happens paradoxically without the persecution
100%.
of Al-Ma'mun.
And
You know what I mean?
As this is the beauty of Al-Ma'mun's rule as phenomena.
Yeah.
Right. I absolutely do not agree with the kind of persecution he carried out. Right.
No, absolutely.
But-
Neither do I.
But the revolutionary fervor that engendered in orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Right. You could say that yes, he was a proto-liberal hegemonist.
Yeah.
Right. And today you see the split in the Muslim world in the Sunnis and the Shias, but you've got the proto-Sunnis of the time who, the Imam Abu Hanifas and the people who are really looked up to by Sunnis today, and you've got the proto-Shia of the time, both united against
him.
Against Al-Ma'mun.
Yeah.
Right. And this is, I feel like people don't realize how many times the entirety of the Muslim world has been united in for the right cause throughout history.
Yeah.
So these things have happened.
Yeah.
You know, and then what it also does is, from a phenomenological level,
Yeah.
engenders the greatest or some of the greatest periods of productivity, both in orthodoxy, because the orthodoxy being crushed says that I'm going to vie for more influence and power, so we need to produce more scholarly output.
Yeah.
Right? So the disciples of Imam Abu Hanifa have incredible output in the next few years, right? Even though some of them are co-opted, made judges, whatever, but some of them persist. And at the same time, the repressive Mutazilite regime has so many resources and so much state patronage that although they come up with some incredibly controversial and repressive stances, they also inject a flavor of a Hellenistic philosophy into the Islamic world that persists to this day.
Yeah. And
So-
from that you get Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi,
Yeah.
all these absolutely brilliant thinkers. So
So just in terms of influence, we cannot knock Al-Ma'mun's hustle. Now, we're not saying it's good or bad. I'm not saying this is good or bad.
I think at his
lot of it's
best,
bad.
I think at his best, Al-Ma'mun was like the biggest intellectual patron. You do not have the Islamic golden age. You do not have any of this stuff specifically without Al-Ma'mun. The intellectual output at his time, for reasons that he meant or he didn't, they don't really matter to the fact that there was so much intellectual output that came out of his time. Yeah, he's a very, very great figure.
And look, this is what
Like, there's
actually,
some things he did that were absolutely amazing, and there's some things that he did where
they were pretty, I think they were pretty terrible.
yeah,
honest, yeah,
no,
they're-
he did both. He did
yeah.
both. He did both. We have to,
Because
you can't
likely,
split these people into binaries.
yeah,
You know.
because if I look, like if I were to transport myself back then, I would probably be being oppressed by Al-Ma'mun, bro.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
So he was very heavy-handed with the intellectuals and the Muslim scholars who the majority of people supported.
Yeah.
Right. So that was a pretty dark side of his rule.
Yeah.
So it is ultimately not to say that I rate Al-Ma'mun as a person to be a negative,
Mm.
but I'm not here to judge him.
Yeah.
There was a lot of productivity
Yeah.
throughout as a result of his oppression
Yeah.
that came out of the Islamic world.
Also, the result of his patronage.
Also as a result
Let's
of
be
both,
fair to him.
right? And I think about it this way,
Yeah.
right? If all the philosophy and the Islamogram bros, right?
Yeah.
You rail against Mutazilite thought in an ultra logic-based version of faith, right? The only reason you have this dialectics since then of the more faith-based and the more logic-based, or the more philosophy-based and the more logic-based engaging with each other, and the only reason you have these arguments is because that phenomenon happened.
Yeah.
You're much more well prepared to deal with things you don't agree with because of it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is useful.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that the person, the most notable caliphate to come immediately after him, though, like, he would take my spot for probably the most destructive caliph who came, and that's Al-Mutasim. So Al-Mutasim, basically, comes right after, or maybe I think there was one guy in between him and
Yeah, there was someone.
Al-Wathiq,
Yeah.
but he's largely a footnote. So Al-Mutasim comes in. He makes a mercenary army of Turkic slave warriors who have no connection to the land whatsoever, who have no roots or no historical connection to the Abbasid Caliphate. They're basically slave warriors, and they only have loyalty to Al-Mutasim. Now, the thing is that these guys are great warriors. They really know how to fight, and I think these guys are basically the Navy SEALs of
Yeah.
entire Abbasid
Yeah.
Caliphate. Okay, so all the special operations, all the raids on the Byzantine Empire, everything is being carried out.
And your
by these guys.
traditional military gets sidelined.
And your traditional military gets sidelined. So what Al-Mutasim does is, like, he's not really an intellectually inclined guy, really. He's not really into all the intellectual gooning of like Al-Mansurs and the Harun al-Rashids and
Yeah.
Al-Ma'muns of this world. He's more of a military man. He sits in the barracks with his soldiers and they game plan to fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's a pretty simple guy. He just likes to fight. So what they do is that, listen, man, we're not kind of welcome in Baghdad where the traditional elite is. They don't really saw the Turks as, like, these backward savages type of thing. It's like the one thing that the Arabs and the Persians both agreed on at the time was like, we don't like the Turks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it was an element of sour grapes to them. And it's like, who are the new guys who have no connection to the land, who have just become extremely influential?
Well,
Because
and
they know how to fight?
also a lot of accounts say that a lot of those fighters weren't even Muslims, so
Yeah.
they didn't. People did not perceive them as being aligned with the cause. They were just guns for hire.
They were basically, it was a mercenary army. So what Al-Mutasim does is that he makes a new capital of Samarra, which is like some couple 100 kilometers north of Baghdad, and he makes that his capital, and he basically sits with his entire Turkic court over there. Directly, there wasn't that much problem directly because he kind of kept all the factions at hand, because, like I said, the Turks were loyal to him, and he was too powerful for anyone to really
Yeah.
make a meaningful rebellion against him, because he was probably the most accomplished military leader in the Abbasid Caliphate at the time, and arguably Abbasid history. But when he dies, what happens is that his successor Al-Mutawakkil is basically courted by the Baghdadi elite to, like, hey, listen, let's put an end to these the Turkish influence in court. And so he really starts gunning against the Turkish influence. They start persecuting them. I think there were like 5 very, very influential Turkish generals at the time, and he starts making moves against all of them. This really pisses them off. And like I said, these guys know how to fight. So what eventually happens is that they assassinate him, Al-Mutawakkil, and then you have this period of, like, this is where the real decline of the Abbasid
There's a
Caliphate
string
starts.
of Turkish military men-led coups, like
Yeah.
we referenced
Yeah,
earlier
yeah.
as well.
So what the period that
And most importantly,
Yeah.
in my opinion, the beginning of the financial overstretch of the Abbasids also begins here.
Yeah.
Because once you've got the Turkish warriors in a position where they're making demands, where they're saying that you either give me X amount of resources or I'm going to align with the next guy,
Yeah.
right? Which is the harm of a mercenary group. You're forced to fund a standing army, which you didn't do before.
Yeah.
You have a fixed expense, and then whatever they extort out of you after it,
Yeah.
right? And then again, if you have one bad year, like I said earlier, in Iraq, and you're not able to get the agricultural revenue that you expected, your frontier regions are immediately under threat.
Yeah.
And bro, Abdurrahman here, the Idrisid Empire, North Africa, this was a time of infinite conquest. Like, there's always war happening,
Yeah.
in this flammable part of history. And
Exactly,
if
exactly.
overstretching yourself is just...
Empowering the Turks. So yeah, this was not a great move for the Caliphate at the time. What happens is this anarchy at Samarra after this, where you have, in a 10-year stretch, you have 4 different caliphs get assassinated or overthrown by the Turkish military establishment. So you, it's really, at this point, it's like the Caliphate has seen its peak, and it's just ebbing and flowing between it. It's like it's on a terminal decline. It gets like a few jolts of energy, comes back for a bit, but it's mostly a decline from here on out. At this point, you start seeing some fracturization, where it's like the Fatimids become the rulers of Egypt and North Africa. what happens is that the Bumayyads start like puppeteering the Abbasids and take over that entire Iraq region. You start getting the Ghaznavids rise up in the Khorasan province.
But it's worth talking about the ebb and flow and what structurally
Yeah.
it is that enables the caliphate to last several hundred years, half a millennium.
Yeah. They were still always there in ceremonial roles. Like, even if they'd lost power at certain point during the Bumayyads or the Seljuk Turks or even the Fatimids era,
Yeah,
they
but
still
see,
had that ceremonial role as religious leaders of
so the
caliphate.
unique structure is worth talking about because it's like ex Holy Roman Empire or the Mughals. Once they were gone, they were gone.
Yeah.
There was no yes, their empires also grew and shrunk and all that's true. But even when a Abbasid Caliph lost control to the extent that all he governed was Baghdad, even barely, right? Even then, you've seen them bounce back, right? And what's really interesting is like there's the Khaldunian approach, which is like, they've gone partial cycles and then bounced back.
Yeah.
A lot of the authorship of that time actively perceives this as a religious phenomenon. So they say that let's go back to the eve of the declaration of the caliphate.
Yeah.
Al-Saffah's uncle, who was a direct descendant of the Hashemite household,
Yeah.
the original Hashemite,
Yeah.
right?
Abbas, yeah.
He, in his speech to the people when declaring the caliphate, because Al-Saffah was quite young, says that we are here to stay, we are here with divine sanction, and the Abbasids will be around until we are charged with the responsibility of handing over rulership to Jesus, the son of Mary.
Yeah.
So these are the world-beating terms in which the Abbasids envisioned themselves, and I don't think it's any coincidence that they had this lasting power because of it.
Yeah.
And once you've styled yourself as this institution that's both religious and of secular governance,
Yeah.
what happens every time? People, all of the little governorates, even the Bumayyads, by the way, the Bumayyads, because
Like,
they
they
were
didn't wipe out the Abbasids. They
No, no, no.
puppeteered them, but they still
No,
saw
no,
the
I'm saying something
importance of
else.
keeping them. Okay.
They were these guys were a kind of a nouveau riche kind of group.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because in their part of the world where they came from, further east, they were seen as a lesser tribe, or I think they were like fishermen or something before. So it became really important to them to be in the good graces of the Abbasid Caliphate, because this was elite sanction for their authority against people who look down upon them.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of these reasons where people as far as the Ghoris in Afghanistan are coming to seek the caliphal blessing.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So when you're contending with them, they lasted long because for the most part, they were pretty pious people. They really cared about the greater good of the entire Islamic world. They tried to make everyone kind of get along, be it Shias, Sunnis, Alids, XYZ.
And
They wanted everyone to get along.
There's also
That's why they did really well.
a deep sophistication there, in the sense that all of the people who are at some point, the Turks, the Samanids, all these guys are trying to get their guy into the seat.
Yeah.
None of them are opposing the seat,
Yeah.
which says we recognize the structural importance of the position. Right? This is like proto-republicanism at its finest.
Yeah.
We're saying this is not like, oh, the king's wiped out, dynasty's gone.
Yeah.
It's like we recognize the importance of the seat. Anyone who meets XYZ criteria can fix it, can fill it. And we're going to keep deposing caliphs and placing them in that seat, which is a testament to the power of the seat as opposed to the weakness of the seat, because they recognize how influential it can be.
Yeah, absolutely. So coming back to their actual destruction, which happened in like 1258 they ruled on as ceremonial leaders in the Mamluk Sultanate for a while afterwards, but like 1258 is really when it's like end of the line.
They see a couple of resurgences. So like I think it was Al-Mu'tadid. I might be wrong. I have to correct it. Well, Al-Mu'tadid, who regained control over parts of Egypt when the Fatimids were dissipated.
Was that Salahuddin Ayyubi who took care of the Fatimids? I think it was he. Salahuddin Ayyubi, man. That guy.
But
I mean, it's not
the
about.
Ayyubids were a state within the were blessed by the caliphs, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Ayyubids.
So it might have been
bas-
under
yeah.
Al-Mu'tadid's reign.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think the Ayyubids took blessing from the Abbasids, then they took care of the Fatimids.
Yeah.
And Salahuddin Ayyubi himself was like the guy who put the
Yes.
nail in the Fatimid coffin,
Exactly.
and he's also the one who took care of the Christians for us in the Crusades.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And took
So
back Jerusalem.
Salahuddin Ayyubi, he took over Jerusalem. Yeah. Salahuddin Ayyubi is a pretty base guy. He
And,
was one of the more notable figures of the late Abbasid Caliphate, even though he wasn't part of the Caliphate himself. Yeah.
and you see that, for example, right before, at the turn of the 13th century, 50 or so odd years before the great tragic fall of Baghdad happens, that you've got leaders like Al-Nasir who actually managed to start piecing the empire together again. And you see before that, when the Seljuks are very active, that there's intermarriage
Yeah.
between, I think, Alp Arslan's family and the Caliph, right? And they're most opportune. And just like the earthquake looked like divine intervention at the eve of the Abbasid revolution against the Umayyads, you see that Alp Arslan says, I am effectively the backbone of this empire. My son will marry your daughter, he says to the Caliph.
Yeah.
And the Caliph says, we never marry our daughters outside because then someone else will get a claim to the Caliphate. And the Caliph asks the Seljuk leader for a month. And within 10 days, the Seljuk leader is dead.
Okay.
And which is probably the only reason that lineage continued.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the marriage would have had to happen because the bride was transferred to them.
The Seljuk
They
Turks.
had been transferred.
Yeah.
So, and this Seljuk period in particular shows off the ceremonial role of the Caliph, I think, at its best.
Yeah.
Because these guys are like, two peas in a pod.
Yeah.
Some of the Seljuk leaders. And I don't think that the Seljuks would have enjoyed quite the dominance that they did if they didn't have not just the blessing of the caliphs, which even others had, even the Umayyads had before them, but the very explicit and enthusiastic coordination that they had with the caliph, to the point that Seljuk leaders would publicly kiss the ring of the caliph.
Yeah.
They would have large processions in his favor.
Yeah.
Right? So they, it's like a head of state, it's like a prime minister president split in Pakistan. Like, executive authority on paper lies with the prime minister, but the president is a ceremonial leader who's supposed to unite all the people.
Yeah.
That's kind of how they were.
That's kind of the role they were
at that
playing
point.
at the late point.
Then Al-Nasir comes, and those 30, 40 years, we love to think, or at least we would love to think, that it was a weakening of the Abbasid Empire that resulted in its destruction.
It was an overconfidence in a lot of ways.
It was overconfidence.
There was one, the last caliph basically, like, I think after they took back the caliphate, they were back in their seat.
They'd been doing the best they had for a long time.
Yeah, and
that actual political
and this is my complaint with the Abbasids over the years, is that they just don't see the importance of having an army as much as they should have had. So what happens is that they take back the empire, they kind of disband the army because the army is expensive, but it's like, still keep a little bit of an army, man. And what happens is that you've got the Central Asians, you've got the Mongols knocking on the door. It's like, hey, listen. And the Mongols, man, like, don't with the Mongols. The Mongols are basically like, okay, we're knocking on your door. You bow down to us or we will destroy you. And I think the caliph at the time thought, like, oh, who's this bacha, punk? Who's this punk who's trying to mess with me? This is just another one of these, like, little uprisings that we've been dealing with for the past 400 or 500 years. But this is a different animal altogether. You talk about the Mongols. So what happens is that the Mongols come in, and in quick period of time, they end up taking Baghdad. They start, like, they put the place on house arrest. Now, when they're doing this entire, like, kind of ethnic cleansing in Baghdad, the people they do spare are Christians, because Hulagu Khan, who was the Mongol Khan at the time, was like, his mom was a Christian. So he's like, I like the Christian. I'm not
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's like, I'm not going to do anything to Christians. But, like, even when they were negotiating with the Mongols, right? This just says how bloodthirsty the Mongols were at this time. It's like, okay, the 3,000 most accomplished scholars, academics, businessmen of Baghdad, leave the city walls, come outside to negotiate with us. They come outside to negotiate with the Mongols, they slay all of them.
Oh God.
It's typical Mongol fashion. And what happens is once they get in, they take control of Baghdad for a few years, and eventually what they do, they sack the place. I think some estimates say they end up killing like 800,000 people or so. And arguably, the worst thing that they do is that they burn down the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. So there were reports, not reports, there was like this account that, the river Tigris ran black with the inks of all the books they threw into there. So
That
it's
is
like,
a very powerful
we
image.
talk about the intellectual achievements of the Abbasids, and it's arguable that some of the most important stuff that we don't even have, like,
We don't know what we don't know.
we don't even know what we don't know. It's like it's probable that we only have like maybe 5 to 10% of the work that they actually did over there. So it's very, very unfortunate, and I don't think in a lot of ways Muslim intellectual life has still not recovered from what the Mongols did to the Abbasids, especially with the book burnings and stuff. It's like, but the worst thing you can do to a civilization is book burning and book
Yeah.
desecration. It's like they did this to Carthage as well when they finally took over Carthage. Because Carthage was also at that time another one of the extremely progressive, extremely learned civilization. And what they did, the ones they took over, they salted the land so that crops could never grow there again, and they destroyed all the books.
That's horrible.
So it's like the worst fate as a civilization you could suffer. It's like, of course, the genocide of the people is horrible, but to destroy the legacy of that. Luckily for the Abbasids and like that period of time, the Europeans became suzerains of the knowledge that they created and stuff, and they propelled the Renaissance and the Enlightenment through Abbasid Arabic works. So we still have a strong account of them, but only God knows what
Literally,
lost.
only God knows.
And
but, yeah.
we actually do know about the intellectual heritage that we lost with the fall of the Abbasids, which
I feel
is
like,
the top 5 most tragic moment in Muslim history. I would say.
absolutely.
What happened
Absolutely.
to them? We're still recovering from the strike of the Mongol iron. But yeah, overall they were pretty cool. They were pretty solid.
I really like the.
I think I really think they only have one weakness, which was like they didn't take the military as serious as they should have. They should have found a way, and that's exactly what killed them at the end.
My reading of the military situation is different.
Mm.
I agree with you to the point that they should have kept their military campaigns focused around, or the nucleus of their military campaigns should have been a local standing army that had ties to the cause, and that ideally, in my opinion, should have been Khorasani, because those are the guys who have been delivering return to the first aeon of the empire.
Yeah,
And that's because they had this unique link. They had it in them to prove to the Arabs, right? They had that thirst that led to the initial revolution in the first place. And the probably the only single loyal court that the early Abbasid rulers ever had was that court of the Abnas, who were the Khorasani fighters.
Yeah.
Because they were revolutionaries. They weren't ordinary bureaucrats or nobles.
Yeah.
So sidelining that ethic that had been around for like a couple of 100 years and replacing it with mercenaries, you see it today with the Taliban and whatnot, or any part of the world where countries have supported proxies, that eventually you lose control of them and they come back to bite you in the neck.
Yeah.
Right? So that's pretty much what happened. So there I completely agree with you. But then what I also think of, again, this is a counterfactual, so I can't argument, is that if they had done that, right, would the military, like the Turkic factions did, have empowered itself enough that it started staring them down and draining resources, weakening the center so that the periphery could not sustain, and then shrinking the empire?
Yeah.
Because that's what, to me, so far seems is the pattern of regress and progress in the size of.
Yeah, I mean,
To be,
it's very
it's up
to
in
be
the air.
decided. Yeah. I'm being an arrogant prick by saying, oh, they did this wrong. It's like, yeah, Harun al-Rashid, you should have.
Listen
If
to
you
the
were
back-
so smart, you should have
Listen to the Turkish
resurrected the future of me to advise you on what to do. But that's being unfair.
No, it's
Overall,
a,
they were great.
it's a
yeah.
fair criticism, right?
Yeah.